Fate. Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 85-86. Chapter 85. Nero Fest. 3 Nero Fest. 3 The arrow struck the dead center of the target, as if it had always been destined to strike true. Arash smiled to himself as he lowered his bow, turning to face the archer next down the line. The tanned servant in red merely hummed in response as he nocked his own arrow. I cannot help but feel as though this competition is weighted against me, Archer remarked with a hint of amusement, considering I am competing with the great Arash Kamingir of all things. He glanced at the servant out of the corner of his eye and gave him a smirk. Don't you think so? Arash raised an eyebrow at him. Really, I think it's all in good spirits. He shrugged, gesturing to the targets and then to the roaring crowd in the stands. They seem to be enjoying it. Romans are notorious in their amusement of one-sided beatdowns. Archer commented as he drew the bow back, loosening the arrow soon after and striking dead center of the target. In all honesty, do you not think this might be an odd manner of competing? He got a confused blink in response. Do you seriously believe there is an archer here who would miss a target at this distance? He honestly asked, dismissing his bow and crossing his arms. It might entertain them, but it is hardly a challenge. I concur. The final target was all but atomized as an arrow the size of a small tree impacted it, obliterating both the target and the ground the target was standing up. The pair of servants flinched at the explosion before they both turned to their left, seeing the giant form of a third archer looming over them. Goff slowly lowered his giant bow and gave a disappointed rumble. I recall the great competitions of old, there was challenge in them. I suppose you might be right. Arash chuckled, scratching the back of his head and looking around. What do you suggest we do to make it more interesting then? Archer remained silent as he looked at the other two, humming to himself. What about a moving target? Another voice called out. The trio looked down to see Artemis floating near them with Orion sitting upon her head. The bear having spoken up and looking around. You know, try and test your aim a bit more sort of thing? Thee suggests a moving target. Goff rumbled, nodding his head. Doth thee have a plan, small? What art thou? Don't worry about it, big guy. Orion waved his hand in dismissal, then cupped his small chin with a pawed hand. I think there's this thing that they do now called a clay pigeon shoot. Archer raised an eyebrow then looked up at Goff. I don't think there's a pigeon big enough for this one. Goff shrugged in response, not even attempting to deny the statement. Art there dragons about, perchance? I don't think so, Orion replied honestly, then looked back towards the stands. I think I saw one of these guys riding one, but I don't think he'd let you loose an arrow at it. Is it me, or is that giant looking at us? Lothian quietly whispered to the others on the bench. Martha and Jean nodded their heads while Faram's own dropped into his hands. Lothian noticed the god's odd behavior and raised an eyebrow. Is something wrong with your lordship? Not really, Faram shrugged, just telling Storm not to come out is all. His voice slightly strained, mainly because if he does come out, Goff is going to ground him faster than anyone can do anything about. Oh, Martha looked towards the god. Is he an old acquaintance of yours? Yes. Faram nodded his head, pausing and then looking down at the saint. I'd also advise you to keep your own friend close by, considering he'd also hunt them for sport as well. Martha stared blankly at him for a few moments, then turned her head to look back at the giant who was still looking towards their group. I believe I will take that advice to heart. That would be wise of you. Something wrong, big guy? Orion queried, breaking Goff out of his trance and bringing his attention back to the barren goddess. You'll recognize someone or something. Perhaps. Goff replied with a hint of unsureness in his tone, then shook his head. 'Tis the trick of the mind perhaps. Thee were speaking of dragons? Yeah. Orion nodded his head, or something else of the like. He paused, then looked back towards the stands at a certain god in particular. I've got an idea. The bear replied, then looked down at Artemis. Hey, dear? Yes, darling. The goddess looked up at him, gently reaching up and taking hold of the bear and lifting him off her head and holding him just in front of her. Do you need something? Just a quick question. Orion replied, that Gwendolyn kid, he could make illusions right. Gwendolyn? Goff looked towards the crowds then slowly nodded his head. Ah yes, He was always skilled in the art of shapecraft. Thee believes him capable of mimicking worms. He paused, moving his right hand to scratch his chin. Perhaps 'tis worth the ask in any event. Dragon hunting? Artemis blinked, tilting her head and then smiling. I have just the servants to help, she excitedly went on, virtually bouncing with glee. Also I feel bad for ruining her race. Oh boy. PFFFFFFTHAHAHAHAHAHAHAHAHAHA. The only sound to be heard across the entire stadium was the roar of Goff's laughter. The giant had hunched himself over to the point he was propping his body up with a hand on his knee as he continued his thunderous sounds of amusement. The other servants remained silent. The only ones who had a hint of what the giant found so amusing were Gwendolyn and Ferrum. The former had a slight twitch of his lip as he stared down at the odd servant out in the lineup of archers. The latter was just staring down at the center of the arena towards the individual with an utterly dumbfounded expression. Sanora fidgeted as the giant continued his laugh, raising his other hand and pointing at her as the laughter only seemed to intensify. The lancer looked around at the others, now feeling very self-conscious about the fact the giant was just laughing in her face. The fact of the matter was that the moment he had caught sight of her head had begun laughing. Mildaddy Artemis, Sanora whispered out to the goddess in a slightly dejected tone. Do I really need to be here? Artemis was too busy scowling at Goff to answer her, the giant now clutching at his chest as he eventually ran out of air to fuel his laugh, panting heavily with each breath sounding like a tree falling over in the woods. Letting out one last ground-shaking breath, Goff eventually straightened himself out, holding his fist up to the area of his helmet where his mouth would be and coughing several times to clear his throat. After shaking his head, he held his hand up in surrender towards Artemis and Sanora. I meant thee no disrespect, but it is simply that ha ha ha. Another giggle bubbled its way from his throat. Ha ha ha. I merely knew the one whose armor that was based upon. He explained, shaking his head. Seeing a human wear it, I could not help but imagine his reaction. Sanora stilled. Why, you mean the great dragon slayer of the sun? She squeaked out in a quiet voice. He wouldn't be offended, would he? Terribly confused, perhaps. Goff chuckled, shaking his head. Dear me. I know that the good Sir Artorias would never allow him to live such a display down without comments upon it. His tone was as light as it could possibly go before he placed his hands on his hips. Nevertheless, I have for thee high expectations. Thee wears the armor of a dear friend. 'Twould be a great comfort to see thee of good skill with that spear. Well, Sanora looked around nervously, the woman's eyes colored with hesitance before she eventually opened her mouth to respond. Here, the lancer jolted as a shadow passed over her head. The woman looked up and promptly gaped as the distinct form of Caffrey passed overhead, the girl beating her wings and giving a wide smile as she flew around the eye height of Goff. Take this, the goddess shouted out, throwing down a single coin into the hands of the lancer. Lady Caffrey. I cannot accept, just do it. Caffrey cut off her attempt and placed both her hands on her hips, staring down at the lancer with an encouraging smile. Good luck. She looked at Goff and promptly blinked as if realizing he was there. You're big. And thou art rather small, little goddess. Goff replied with an amused tone of voice, moving his hand up to scratch his chin. Thee has wings of golden shine. The girl beamed at the praise and rapidly nodded her head, spreading them wide as if to show them off further. Yep. Mother always said they were a symbol of angelic beauty. She paused, placed a single finger on her chin and tilted her head in confusion. Although I've never met that many angels, she remarked, her eyes scanning the crowd before they seemed to glow as she locked onto some. Never mind. She happily exclaimed as she shot off away from them. Goff watched her leave silently before he turned down to the others. Thee referred to her as Lady Caffrey? He asked Sanora. The lancer rapidly nodded her head. The Princess of Haida, she explained, daughter of Queen Guinevere and King Flan. Goff let out a snort. King Flan? He rumbled with a tone of barely concealed amusement. A title he gifted himself, no doubt. Shaking his head, the giant looked across to where Gwendolyn was seated. Lord Gwendolyn's niece then, he mused quietly to himself before shaking his head. Let us begin preparations for a true competition. Sanora remained silent before she looked down at the gold coin in her hands and then towards the individual next to her. Atalanta stared back at her with a curious expression before her eyes shifted to where Caffrey had flown off to. She is a child goddess. Lady Caffrey. Sanora nodded her head. She is younger than most other lords, she admitted. Is it really appropriate for me to be here? Atalanta raised an eyebrow. How is it not? I don't have a bow. Sanora pointed out, raising her cross spear and waving it. See? Can you not throw it? I do not believe just throwing it would allow me to truly compete with those of the archer class. Sanora replied with a frown. There is a reason it is the class of the bow and arrow. Those who dedicated their life to the art would surely be displeased to hear me attempt to compete with them under the preconception that hurling weapons makes me their equal. Archer snorted, drawing the attention of the two cat women respectively. The tanned servant gave the pair a smirk which just screamed that he knew something they didn't. Trust me. The qualifications for being an archer are not nearly as strict as you think them to be. He's right. Arash supported with a wry smile, sighing. I knew of this blonde guy who just hurled swords around sometimes and he was apparently an archer. The tanned archer grimaced as if remembering something unpleasant, a rather boisterous laugh. Yeah, Arash replied with a nod, the loudest. He shrugged, quite skilled with those two swords of his as well. Archer nodded then paused. A frown soon came to his face followed by one of confusion. A man with twin swords who would occasionally use swords as projectiles and was apparently within the archer class. He blinked. Had he actually been copied by him of all people? Then you just need a target? Gwendolyn called back down to the giant. Goff nodded his head in response. Preferably a moving one. Goff rumbled back, shifting his massive frame and pointing towards the gathering of archers, so that we might find which of us is more skilled. HMPH. Gwendolyn merely hummed in response, then looked past him and down into the stands. Is that human woman really wearing? Indeed, does she know who wore? She does. Most strange. Gwendolyn mused to himself, then turned to face Goff once again before he shifted his lips into a faint smile. I will provide you with a most suitable target for your practice, Sir Goff. His tone contained a mischievous hint, as if there was something more to the statement. Goff stared at him in silence for a few moments, trying to figure out what he meant before giving a low hum and marching back over where the others were. Medusa stared at the expression on Gwendolyn's face with a slight trace of curiosity. You look as though you have something planned. Before Gwendolyn could respond, the Gorgon sisters instantly leapt onto the words. Look, me. Urieli pointed towards the pair with a teasing smile. Medusa can already tell what he's thinking at a glance. Quite so, myself. Steno replied with a grin to match her sister. Maybe they are closer than we thought. The goddess looked down at Medusa and giggled. Perhaps our jests about you finding a companion have some weight, little sister. Medusa flinched, tightening herself up and fidgeting nervously. Before Gwendolyn could make to comment, Quelaag chose that opportunity to speak up. Is it me, or are those snakes of yours standing up a little straighter? The Chaos Witch asked with a perfectly innocent tone of voice as she pointed towards his dress. And dear me. Did I miscount or is that another one? Pwah! Gwendolyn spluttered in shock as he spun around to face the witch. Must you use such crude humor? Where is your sense of decorum? Quelaag gave him a raised eyebrow in return, meaningfully gesturing to her lower half. Would decorum really help me with this? It is merely for formality's sake. Gwendolyn got through gritted teeth, exhaling and shaking his head. Besides, Lady Medusa and I. Ooh, Quelaag's grin turned positively shark-like. Lady Medusa. How noble of you, Linny. She gestured towards his head. Do you tip your crown at her as well? Gwendolyn gave her the flattest expression he could manage. The Chaos Witch merely elected to grin back at him in amusement. The god of the moon eventually released a barely concealed huff of annoyance as he turned back towards the arena. Will you be wishing luck to Sir Goff? He eventually asked. I realize you enjoy breaking the norms. Perhaps you will be the one to gift him a rose and not the other. Quelaag punched him in the side of the head. What on earth are they doing up there? Archer asked aloud as he stared up towards the stands. The collection of divine-related beings swiftly descending into a childish scuffle. Arash followed Archer's line of sight before releasing a snort. Looks like the lady decided to use that sharp wit of hers again. The Persian explained with a shake of the head, frankly, I'm surprised it took her this long. A common occurrence then. For them. Who knows? Arash shrugged. For her. Oh yes. She was quite adept in the art of, what would you call it? Verbal sparring. He elaborated with a mirthful expression, I suspect they'll eventually stop. Archer pointedly watched as Gwendolyn wrapped one of his snake legs around Quelaag's neck in an effort to strangle her while she tried to pry his helmet off. Really? Oh, give it but a few moments. Goff remarked with amusement of his own, they shall bleed this theater from their system eventually. She was actually one of little Gwendolyn's few friends as children. He gestured to the pair, this is rather in line with what their time as children was. Really? Arash chuckled, sounds about right for kids though, doesn't it? I was never a father, so I could not answer thee. Goff replied. The servants continued to watch as the Gorgon sisters and Asterios backed away from the wrestling duo as the fight threatened to involve them as well. I'm going to assume we aren't getting that competition anytime soon. Atalanta voiced out, watching the display with a raised eyebrow, then looked to Arash, are we? I don't see it. The man shook his head, then pointed to his eyes, and I see a lot of stuff. He trailed off, slowly turning towards the far end of the arena, to where there was a grate in the sand which led to a pit, and raised both his eyebrows. In fact, give it a moment. The other servants all looked in the direction he was staring. The archer himself continued to look at it expectantly for what felt like ages. After nearly half a minute of staring, Sanora finally mustered up the courage to speak up. Are we waiting, foe? The grate exploded, the metal lid being flung nearly a foot into the air before it slammed back into the ground with a heavy clunk. Dead silence spread across the entire Colosseum as a small billow of smoke rose out from the hole. Arash nodded slowly and turned back to Sanora, throwing a thumb over his shoulder and giving the girl a casual smile. We're waiting for that. And what was that? Orion asked, staring at the smoke with a hint of puzzlement. What was even down there anyway? You snake-footed, dark-spawned little toad. A rather gruff and angered voice roared out, jolting everyone's attention back to the hole. Gwendolyn clicked his tongue as he let go of Quelaag, the chaos which in turn released his gown. The dark moon god turned his attention towards the hole as a figure climbed out of it. Sullivan shook clean the remaining chains which clung to his body, one of which was still tied around his leg and dragging behind a wooden pillar as he hauled himself out into the open. The caster glared up at the stands as best as his featureless face could manage. I suppose you think chaining me like some common dog was clever. It was. Gwendolyn called back, sounding more irritated than anything else. How did you get free? You think mere chains could hold me? The pontiff sneered back. Yes, the chains of oppressors will never contain the spirit of the free man. Another rather boisterous voice echoed out, soon followed by a blur throwing themselves into the sky. Not him again, Atalanta grumbled out loud, slamming her hand into her face and shaking her head, earning a look of puzzlement from everyone who actually heard her. A gray blur slammed into the ground next to Sullivan, kicking up a rather large dust cloud and causing the caster to cough heavily and wave his hand in front of his face to disperse it. The newest arrival stood well over the height of the caster, dressed in nothing but a metal plate underwear and a metal mask covering most of his face. The blonde scraggly spilled freely down his face but not far enough to cover the maniac smile the gray-skinned man sported. Wielding a spiked club, the giant pointed up towards Gwendolyn while grinning like a madman. I found my comrade in arms bound in chains, like so many others trapped under your oppression, and granted him the freedom he deserves. With his free hand, he roughly slapped Sullivan on the back and caused him to stumble slightly, to be kept in the dark, and yet his spirit remains unbroken. He is a beacon to all those who bear the weight of oppression. Gwendolyn stared at him in silence for a few moments before only a single word was uttered past his lips. Pardon? Yes. Sullivan nodded his head, gesturing up at Gwendolyn. He is indeed the great oppressor. He chained all the world to his will. The fiend! The berserker exclaimed out in horror. I see you are well at home amongst these other oppressors. He gestured to the Colosseum, where we all fight and die in bloodsport for your amusement. I do not believe any among us have perished. Goff pointed out, scratching his chin as he stared down at the man. The gray-skinned servant turned and stared up at Goff for a few moments before a roaring bark of laughter emerged from his throat. The man pointing his spiked club at the giant. I see now. You're the grandest of oppressors here, clearly having built up your might by treading upon the weak. Sullivan cradled his head in his hands. The sound of your body falling to earth shall be a rallying cry against all oppressors. Thou accuses me of oppression, Goff voiced out in an oddly toneless voice. Of course, the man shouted out, pointing to Sullivan and then to the crowds. Who else would chain a man such as this to these crowds of oppressors? These Romans who hold slaves. He paused, eyes flying wide. There are still brothers and sisters in chains here. He cried out in horror, spinning on his heel and sprinting off towards the nearest gate. I shall free you from your bonds of oppression. The servants watched the man charge off in silence, all staring at his retreating back before they slowly turned back to look at each other. Sullivan remained silent for a few moments, then just quietly started to walk away from them and back towards the crowd, muttering curses under his breath, many of which involved Gwyndolin, without being stopped. Arash just watched the man wander off, then turned back to see the berserker, because he couldn't be anything else, rip the iron bars of the gate asunder and charge out into the streets. Should we stop him? Atlanta just stared at him in silence for a few moments, then shrugged. Do you think we could stop him? Nero's voice echoed out across the stadium. Could someone stop him before he causes too much trouble? Nero? Ritska looked towards the emperor as she sat in her seat, the woman repeatedly tapping her chin with a slight hint of frustration painted on her features. The woman continued to tap away at her chin even as Ritska called out to her, the saber not looking as though the voice even registered to her. Saber. Olga remarked, slightly louder than Ritska, to the woman, who still remained silent. Nero. Nero jolted, spinning in her seat to face the director. Her face brightened when she caught sight of the white-haired woman. Ah, Pale Rose? Olga twitched at the nickname. You needed me? What on earth are you frowning about? She asked, crossing her arms and staring down at the emperor. You dragged us all here and you spent most of the time just scowling at nothing. You're worried about me, Pale Rose. Nero grinned with relief. I am gladdened to hear that. Olga let out a groan as her head fell into her hands. Nero stared at her with trace amounts of confusion for a few moments before she looked to the others present. Ritska waved to the emperor with a faint smile on his face before it turned moderately concerned. Is something wrong, Nero? He asked, tilting his head. You don't look as, he struggled for the right word for a few moments before snapping his fingers, excited. You don't look as excited as you did earlier. Really? Nero frowned, humming to herself and cupping her chin. Yes. I am enjoying these festivities greatly and I believe that my subjects are as well, but I cannot help but feel as though there could be more I can do for them. The emperor remarked, standing up from her seat and moving towards the balcony overlooking the arena itself. It is rather irritable, she admitted. You're worried about it not living up to its potential? Roman voiced through the communicator in a tone of understanding. I guess, at the moment it's not really that different from something like the Olympics, he muttered out, scratching his chin, but still, gathering so many heroic spirits and having them compete against each other in sporting activities without anyone getting injured is terribly dull, Leonidas exclaimed, shaking his head and looking towards Nero, the woman having let out a startled gasp at his sudden shout. The Spartan placed his hands on his hips and stared at the emperor. Where is the sense of competition, the warrior spirit all these heroes no doubt possess? He slammed a hand onto his chest. We are servants fit for fighting, and with so many of us, I would ask we fulfill that natural obligation. Wait a second, Leonidas San. Mash hurriedly spoke out as she realized the direction the conversation was going. There's no need to fight. Fight? Leonidas tilted his head. I was going to suggest a tournament of fighters from every legend competing until we have an accredited winner. The man threw his arms wide. Is that not something to be ventured towards? You want us to run a bloodsport? Olga's lip curled in disgust, like some common Holy Grail war. Leonidas stared down at her. The winner is already getting a Holy Grail, he pointed out, I merely suggest that we make it a more challenging task. We are chock full of many servants from across the world and my spirit is crying out for release." Nero was oddly silent. The woman scrunched her face up in thought for a few moments before she slowly nodded her head. UMU. She grinned, UMU. A most spectacular idea. She spun around and marched towards the balcony. "My Romans. I, Nero Claudius, have gathered the greatest warriors from across the land. It is a sad state of affairs if she believes me to be a warrior." A deep voice grumbled, "As it stands, I'm pitiful in a fight, although that's just natural given my talent lies elsewhere from swinging a club around like some primitive ape." Sullivan stared down at the person he found himself sat next to with a puzzled aura about him. "Are you some manner of dwarf? Are you some manner of discarded Halloween decoration?" The blue-haired child shot back almost instantly. "Aside from that, whatever my appearance might be has no true impact on my words." "Stunted from growth, were you?" Sullivan grumbled, looking away from him and back towards the spot where Nero was shouting from. "She is just stunted in the head. She appeals to the masses and the masses find her amusing." The boy muttered, "It's certainly an art form, although how appealing it actually is very much depends on the tastes of the individual at any given moment." His lip thinned. "The problem with humans is that their tastes tend to change. Give them too much of the same thing and they'll eventually grow bored of it and seek out another form of entertainment." Sullivan gave him a passing glance. "That is the problem of appealing to the common man's tastes. The common man is an idiot who knows not what he truly wants." "Ha!" The boy barked out a laugh. "Spoken like a fool who has never met the common man nor sampled in the tastes of the common man." He pointed at Nero. "Regardless, if that toddler body of hers in any indication, she is also vertically challenged." Sullivan grunted. "And to be lectured on the wisdom of man by a child. How valuable your insight may truly be. Have you ever heard the phrase not to judge a book by its cover?" The boy scoffed. "Actually, forget I asked. You probably avoid books on account of your relatives being turned into them. Aren't you sharp of tongue?" Sullivan gave a hollow laugh. "A brain of wisdom within that feeble body of yours perhaps?" "Wisdom." The boy's face scrunched up as if he'd heard something ugly. "I would hardly call it wisdom. It is as much the blatant truth as anything another is liable to hear. Whatever reaction a person has to my words is for them alone." HMPH. Sullivan looked away. "Then I will leave you to your words, child." HMPH. "Then I will accept this generosity from you, tree. And have brought them to the greatest civilization in the world." Nero failed to notice almost a dozen heads turn and glare up at her. "For your entertainment." She reached into somewhere and pulled forth the glowing shape of the Holy Grail. "Now they will compete in a tournament for this grand prize." The crowd positively exploded with applause as the Chaldeans behind her could only stare with a large degree of exhaustion. "So, does this mean we're gonna have to compete?" Roman asked, chuckling nervously. "Because we probably should make sure that we get the Grail." Olga clicked her tongue, looking back at the doctor and then towards Nero. She could just order Berserker to grab the Holy Grail now and call it a day. She was confident Stahl could easily best the Emperor, although there was the problem of fame boost. Nero was standing in Rome itself. She was likely receiving a great deal of regional support as a result. Not to mention the half-dozen servants she had probably summoned, with that Holy Grail likely not taking too kindly to it. "Yes." Olga got out through gritted teeth, turning towards Ritska, Ash and Mash. "We apparently are now fighters and champions." Nero shouted out. "The roses have aligned, the festival is nigh. My fellow servants, prepare for battle. Claim glory and win this Holy Grail. A celebration of Rome, the Nero festival." Dead silence echoed out amongst the Colosseum before the stands exploded with noise as the crowd had been worked up into a frenzy. "Well, she's got away with words at least." Ritska nervously chuckled to himself, scratching the back of his neck. "So, what now?" "Now." Olga gave him a flat look. "Now gather up all the servants who are from Chaldea. Inane as I might find this, it is likely the easiest option available to us to play the Emperor's little game for the time being." Nero, however, was much too busy deciding on an order by which to arrange the matches. The Emperor was thinking of which class would go first and what the order would be after that. After a few moments of deliberation, she eventually snapped her fingers and grinned. The saber class shall go last, as it is the class 1 inhabit and therefore it is the best class. She announced, turning to the other Chaldeans, as they say, save the best for last, did they know? Ritsuka snorted, shaking his head, right. Only you Nero, only you. She does have logic, senpai. Mash commented, the saber class is considered the strongest class as it is usually the one inhabited by heroic spirits of great legend. She paused, a majority of the knights of the Round Table would qualify for the saber class and we already face King Arthur and Fuyuki. Ritsuka opened his mouth to reply before slowly closing it. I guess? He shrugged. I suppose Ash is also of the saber class. The saber in question merely grunted in response. Although you'd probably qualify for most other classes, wouldn't you? Ash frowned in thought for a few moments. Likely all but Rider and Berserker. He admitted after a few moments. As I have never had a period in time where I was lost to madness. He paused, at least until the incident on the ocean. I don't think acts of madness contribute to your affinity for the Berserker class after you have already been summoned as a servant, Ash-san. Mash reassured him with a faint smile. They have to occur while you're still alive. Ash merely hummed in response, his eyes briefly flicking to the screen Roman was on. The doctor glanced back at him for a few seconds but said nothing. So, the doctor clapped his hands together, are you going to be working on a team, Fujimaru-kun? I guess. Ritsuka nodded. It depends what we're actually doing. Scratching his cheek, the master sent a fleeting glance towards Nero before looking back at the others. But I'm sure it'll work out. And so my fellow Romans, we begin the Nero festival with the Battle of the Riders. The emperor grinned before pointing down to the Colosseum. In the corner of Chaldea we have the Knight of Madness. That's Paladin of Lunacy actually, Astolfo shouted back, looking as though he wasn't particularly bothered about being called an idiot. It sounds much cooler. Does it though? Boudica asked with squinted eyes and a tone which just oozed incredulity. The pink-haired rider merely shrugged in response. I don't know. I didn't think about the name, and regarded, by himself, to be the cutest servant in Chaldea. Again, by no one but himself as I am here now. The paladin of the Franks, Astolfo. Yeah, the pink-haired boy waved at the crowd. I've got a terrible feeling by the way. He exclaimed in a merry tone of voice. So do I. Boudica grumbled to herself, crossing her arms and glaring at the crowds, especially being here. And accompanying him is, Nero's voice faltered slightly, great warrior queen from a distant land. She recovered, earning a raised eyebrow from the red-haired rider in question. Her name is Bowdy. Astolfo giggled, hey, Bowdy sounds like booby. He pointedly looked at her chest before his eyes turned skyward and he let loose an innocent whistle. Boudica pinched the bridge of her nose and shook her head. I knew I shouldn't have come here. Grumbling to herself, the rider tapped her boot against the ground rapidly as she awaited the announcement of their opponents. And standing against them for the title of Best Rider is, the Emperor trailed off, suddenly sounding very unsure of herself as she looked down again at them then back towards the parchment she had in front of her. Clearing her throat, she spoke out again with a noticeable dip in her confidence. From the land of warriors blessed by a dragon-slaying war god. He rose through the ranks from humble grunt to general of the army, and has never lost a battle. Well, Astolfo cheerfully placed his hands on his hips. We're screwed. He turned his eyes skyward as a shadow passed atop their heads. The silhouette of a blue wyvern rapidly approached the ground. The lizard beat its wings several more times to slow its descent before the rider disembarked. Lothian clambered down from Gorm, planting both boots on the ground with a gentle thud and unholstering his axe from its place on his hip. The rider gave the weapon a few practice swings before he turned his helmet back to face them. One who abandoned the battlefield to find a foe who could best him in combat and failing to do so, shieldless Lothian of Forosa. The general gave the crowd a patient wave of his hand, only occasionally looking at them before he returned his full attention to the duo in front of him. Are the three combatants ready? Hey, Astolfo shouted out. Where's his partner? 2-on-1 doesn't seem very fair. Silence followed in his wake before Nero coughed loudly. All right, if you insist. What are you doing? Boudica hissed at the paladin. Astolfo turned to her and raised an eyebrow in questioning. It was a 2-on-1 advantage. I'm still a paladin, Astolfo pointed out, giving the woman a wide smile. So that means if it's a fair tournament, I don't want to rely on trickery. We get 2 fighters, they get 2 fighters, he pointed at Lothian, and it can't be much worse than the patron god who rules over the land of warriors. Nero bellowed out, Astolfo's smile freezing on his face. And a god of war. I present the dragon rider, Farum of sunlight. Heavy wing beats filled the air, followed by a rumbling growl as a much larger shadow passed above everyone's heads. The giant figure of the near 40-meter-long shape of storm cresting over the top of the Colosseum walls instantly attracted the attention of the crowd. The giant feather drake swung its head upwards and unleashed an earth-shaking roar into the air before it spread its 4 wings wide and pushed itself down towards the center of the Colosseum. Not before giving a passover of the entire stadium before it eventually landed onto the ground. Farum clambered down from Storm. His landing onto the sandy flooring was much less subtle than his follower. The god's feet instantly kicked up a small cloud of dirt as he landed on the ground before straightening himself out. Astolfo nodded his head several times before he replied, "Next time I just won't say anything." "Yeah." Boudica gave him a hollow smile, "You do that." "Are the combatants ready?" Nero called down once again. "As we'll ever be." Boudica muttered to herself as she drew her sword and tensed her body. Astolfo hefted his jousting lance and beamed as wide as he could. "Indeed." Farum rumbled, hefting his large sword spear and planting it into the ground with the tip pointed skywards. The surface of the blade crackled with golden sparks of light as it thrummed with divine power. His dull golden eyes looked between Boudica before they fell onto Astolfo and narrowed. "You. I remember you." "Who? Me?" Astolfo pointed at himself before furiously shaking his head. "Nope. Never met you before in my life. I certainly didn't help in killing your dragon in France. Not me. Nor was I there when someone tackled you off said dragon." He then pointed at the god's legs. "I also definitely didn't steal one of your legs." 3 other riders stared at him with varying degrees of confusion. Boudica eventually decided to do the smartest thing she could in that situation. She took 5 steps to her left and increased the distance between herself and her teammate. What?" Farum tilted his head in puzzlement. "Are you trying to insult me or are you just this stupid?" "Stupid? Me? Never," the rider loudly proclaimed. "Just because I don't have anything even remotely similar to reason and common sense in my body does not automatically make me an idiot." "Are you touched in the head?" Lothian bluntly asked, no longer being able to contain his own confusion in the matter. "Because you sound as though you are a few spears shy of a phalanx." "All my spears are properly accounted for," Astolfo happily exclaimed, waving his jousting lance. "I have my spear for my enemies and my spear for my many lovers." He pointed directly at his waist. "See? Both of them? Although you'll have to take my word on the second one. Roland would just strip himself here and now to show you." "What?" Lothian blinked at the pink-haired boy, then looked towards Farum with his posture one of clear confusion. Farum shrugged and looked towards Boudica for an explanation. Boudica gave a half-smile and shrug in response to their questioning gazes. "Honestly, I don't think anyone really understands him at all." "Perhaps we should just get to fighting," Farum suggested, looking around for confirmation before he straightened himself out. "Excellent." The god's entire posture flipped. The rider span his sword spear around and pointed it directly towards the space between the 2 servants. The blade glowed a brilliant golden as both Boudica and Astolfo widened their eyes in alarm and threw themselves to the ground. The spear unleashed a bolt of pure golden lighting towards them, striking the ground and scorching it immediately. Farum's eyes instantly locked onto Astolfo and the god launched himself forwards to clear the distance between the 2 combatants. Astolfo rolled back to his feet, exhaling through his mouth and gritting. Talk about a close, he cut himself off, releasing a panicked cry and throwing himself back to the ground as the edge of the sword spear sliced through the air above his head. The rider locked eyes with the god as his form towered over him. Scrambling backwards, Astolfo made to clear the distance as Farum raised his leg up to stamp down on him. "Hippo-kun!" Astolfo shouted out. Farum instantly turned himself around as the mount barreled into him and nearly knocked him off his feet. Digging his feet into the ground, Farum wrestled with the mount before he did something almost entirely unexpected. He headbutted it. The hippogriff recoiled from the rather bold attack as Farum spun his spear in his hands, raising it above his head like a club and smacking the hippogriff over the back of the head with the handle of the weapon. The hippogriff's eyes rolled back and the creature slumped over unconscious. What the heck? Astolfo pointed at the god. Animal abuse. Everyone saw it. Who even headbutts a hippogriff? He winced. Bradamante is going to kill me for this. Farum silently turned to face the rider, raising the spear and leveling it towards his head, the tip already glowing with golden light. So, Astolfo let out a nervous chuckle. Is it too late to apologize for the whole, leg thing? Farum continued to stare at him in silence, then abruptly lowered the spear and just touched Astolfo in the gut with the tip of the weapon, which was still crackling with lightning. Astolfo released a rather high-pitched scream as the rider virtually tased the boy with divine lighting for what felt like hours for Astolfo. For everyone else it was barely 10 seconds, before he lifted the spear up again. I would rather you didn't, Farum replied. A warrior does not apologize for his attack. Ouchie, Astolfo rolled on the ground, clutching his stomach and occasionally twitching. I think I peed a little. How is that even? Farum's face scrunched up. What is wrong with your head? The moon stole my brain. What? On the opposite end of the battlefield. It could hardly be said to be going in Boudica's favor either. Lothian swiftly closed the distance with the rider and swung his axe towards her shield. The moment she raised her own guard, the weapon slammed into it with much more force than it had any right to. Boudica staggered as the weight of the axe pushed her backwards before Lothian pulled it back and raised it up high again. Boudica rushed forwards, swinging her straight sword up and hooking it underneath the blade of the axe and halting its descent. Lothian's face was hidden behind his helmet, although that didn't stop her feeling the amusement he clearly had. A rather daring ploy, he mused, swinging the axe towards the side and caused her to overextend while swinging his knee upwards into her gut. The woman let out a heavy cough as she was nearly lifted off her feet by the power of the attack and forced backwards. Unfortunately, it can leave you open to counterattack. Boudica was too busy coughing to reply as Lothian closed in on her, the rider instead opting to swing his weapon upwards in an uppercut movement. She raised her shield to block it and the attack once again slammed into her with much more power than she could anticipate, the impact rattling her bones and causing her to flip with the momentum and onto her back. It was a rather poor situation for you. Lothian muttered out as he hovered above her. I don't blame. He leaned back when Boudica lashed out with a kick towards his head. The Forasan merely tilted his head back with the boot not even touching upon his helmet. Boudica used the power of the kick to roll her body back onto her feet and into a low crouch. Lothian straightened himself out. All right then. His voice was oddly toneless, as if the affair was nothing more than a simple chore for him. Frankly, if what Nero had boasted about him was true, then it probably was. Just her luck to be matched against the type of general who took to the field and still never lost a single battle. Boudica's eyes flickered away from him and towards the blue drake, which was currently curled up and snoring loudly. Her face instantly warped with incredulity before she flashed Lothian a puzzled expression as her eyes darted between the two of them. Lothian merely angled his head in puzzlement before following her gaze onto the sleeping wyvern. Oh, I see. Gorm won't interfere if that concerns you. He waved his hand as if in reassurance. Not until I find a foe I will actually need his help for. That's a little bit insulting, isn't it? Boudica commented, giving him a raised eyebrow. Perhaps. Lothian shrugged, but I have already seen through your movements. You're good, that much I fully admit, but you are not even close to being my equal. His voice was now more disappointed than anything else. If I were to tell you the truth, I would rather have faced both you and the girl alone. Boy. Boudica corrected automatically. Boy? Lothian turned his head back to Astolfo and seemingly stared at him for a short amount of time. Are you sure? He asked again, then raised his arm to catch Boudica's wrist as she tried to swing at him, stopping the movement dead in its tracks without even having turned to face her. I am being serious. Lothian continued on as she struggled to get her arm free. Is that actually a boy? I thought they were just jesting. They're actually a boy, Boudica growled out, then swung her leg into his knee. Her eyes bulged as it felt as though she'd kicked something much tougher than a servant's knee. Wincing, she recalled her foot and hissed through her teeth. "Ah, that would be my ring activating," he muttered, finally turning to face her. "Really, this matchup was just entirely unfair to you." Boudica huffed. "What was your first clue? The undefeated warrior riding a wyvern of all things, or the war god teammate?" Lothian remained silent for a few moments before he spoke again. "I do not believe I can give you an adequate answer which will not." Boudica suddenly closed her eyes as her sword exploded with golden light, releasing a burst of power into the air while also flashing into Lothian's eyes. The general released a grunt as the golden light flooded his vision, briefly blinding him in the process and causing his grip to slacken. Seizing this chance instantly, Boudica ripped her hand free of him before she swung her shield at his head. Lothian thrust his axe into the sky, releasing a thin burst of golden lighting upwards as the shield approached his head. Then Boudica felt her whole body seize up as a brief flash of pain coursed through her entire being. She soon recognized it as being electrocuted before it passed. Lothian swung his body around before slamming a haymaker into the side of her head and sending her to ground with a heavy thud. "Clever," Lothian grunted, "but if flashes of light were all it took to keep me distracted, then I would have made a poor general in a siege." "I'll remember that," Boudica got out as she raised her hand to nurse the side of her head, already feeling sore from the punch. "And with that, we have concluded our first victory for the riders," Nero proclaimed, grimacing slightly as she watched Boudica and Astolfo stumble off to the edge of the field. "Which means we shall now move on to the second battle of the servants." Spreading her arms wide, she beamed, "The assassins." Ritska frowned in thought as he cupped his chin, leaning over to Mash. "Don't we only have one assassin?" "We do." Mash nodded her head, "and Sasaki-san seems to behave more like a saber than an assassin." "I would have thought you'd discuss the catastrophic loss we just suffered," Boudica pointed out, then sent a fleeting glare at Nero, almost as if it was rigged against us. "And now, Nero hastily waved her hands, "I wouldn't do it quite so bad. I didn't know who it was who signed up until I drew the names from the bowl." She pointed towards the golden dish lying atop a small pedestal. "I wouldn't lie about this." Olga gave a flat hum in response as she leaned back into her seat. "Regardless, this might work into our favor. Sasaki Kojira is a superior combatant to most usual assassin-class servants. His performance in the French Singularity is proof of this." "Won't he still be outnumbered if they bring out two servants?" Roman pointed out with a frown. "We've only got one assassin." "Ah, you do?" Nero winced, then looked back at the parchment. "Oh, so you do, I could make it a simple one-on-one fight in the interest of fairness so you can calm yourselves," she offered with a calm smile, then turned back, "and we shall now assemble the fighters for this duel in the art of duplicity and cunning." "Well, that is certainly one way of describing the work of an assassin." Sasaki commented to no one but himself as he stood with his arms tucked into their sleeves, calmly strolling forwards and further into the Colosseum. "Although I would much rather face a saber." "And for the side of Chaldea, here stands the legendary bird slayer himself from the Far East and accredited savior of France." Sasaki blinked in surprise at the sudden title. He might have been there, but he'd hardly have said he was the savior of the country. Still, it got the crowd raring to go, "Sasaki Kojira." The assassin gave a respectful bow to the crowd as he slowed himself to a halt, smiling calmly as he waited for his opponent to appear. And for his opponent, they are a killer from across the sea who slays defenseless women for the pleasure of his foreign god. Sasaki's smile vanished. That just sounded unpleasant. One who shrouds themselves in foul deeds, Lautrec of Karam. A man fizzled into existence, dressed in bronze-colored armor and wielding twin-shuttle swords. The man spun the weapons around as he paced in front of Sasaki, the crowd already booing the man as if he were the grand villain or some such. Sasaki had to give him credit, he didn't look put off in the least by the manner in which the crowd already seemed to despise him. Wordlessly, he reached for the sword on his back and slowly unsheathed it. He gave his new Nodashi a once-over. He had never heard of this Titanite, material before, but he could tell at a glance that this sword was infinitely superior to the one he had previously wielded before it had been broken. A rather unfortunate incident which had apparently worked out in his favor. "I suppose we have already been introduced, so we might skip that formality," Sasaki commented as he assumed a stance and staring at Lautrec with a calm expression. "Then we might begin immediately, no?" HMPH. Lautrec merely twirled the shuttles in his hand as he stared back at the opposing assassin before coming to a halt. Adjusting his footing, Lautrec tensed himself in preparation for a rush. Sasaki, however, looked as though he was in no hurry to adjust his position, content with waiting for the other servant to make their move first. Both Sasaki and Lautrec remained still for what felt like hours before the armored assassin charged, clearing the distance swiftly as he approached with the curved blades swinging from both sides towards Sasaki's midsection. Kojira's body blurred as the man grabbed the nodashi with both hands and swung the blade upwards. The first strike parried the left shuttle high before he swung the sword down into the right shuttle and knocked that off course. Turning his body to face Lautrec sideways, Kojira thrust the pommel of his sword into the man's gut and caused him to stagger backwards away from him. Lautrec stepped back and re-evaluated the man in front of him as Kojira slowly returned to his original posture, as if baiting him to attack again. Narrowing his eyes behind his helmet, Lautrec paced from side to side as he watched the man before coming to a halt once again. He swung down against Kojira, who raised his sword to block the strike with ease, before he swung his other sword in a reverse grip towards his gut. Sasaki's eyes flickered to the blade in question before pushing the other sword away from himself and swiftly backing away so the blow barely touched upon his clothes. Lautrec charged him down, swinging from both or the same side as he attempted to pin down Sasaki. The humble Swallow Slayer kept up a calm expression as he effortlessly parried or blocked the strikes against his person with finesse expected of a swordmaster, or someone posing as one at the very least. It was noted that Kojira had yet to go on the offensive, still defending from Lautrec as the fight went on. Swiftly parrying another strike away from his body, Sasaki shifted his stance and then thrust his nodashi towards Lautrec. The assassin retreated as Kojira launched the first offensive of the entire match. The single thrust blurred just fast enough that Lautrec had to retreat and swing his right shuttle upwards to block the strike. Sasaki didn't leave it at that, soon moving forwards while unleashing a rapid barrage of swift slashes and thrusts towards the assassin. Lautrec stared to frown behind his helmet as the assault continued, quickly becoming apparent that Sasaki was undoubtedly a more skilled swordsman than he was. It just meant he'd have to rely on a little dirty fighting. Stepping further back, Lautrec moved backwards at a considerable distance to try and keep Kojira from easily getting to him, but not so far as to highlight what he was planning. As he jumped back again to avoid a slash at his neck, he rested the edge of his shuttle into the sand and stared at the assassin as he advanced. Once he got close enough, Lautrec swung the sword upwards like a golf club, throwing sand into Kojira's face and charging forwards to accompany the cloud. A resounding clang went off as Sasaki parried away the attack with relative ease through the cloud of sand before twisting his body and slashing away at the thin armor at the side of Lautrec's knee. The nodashi hit home. Lautrec released a grunt as the blade sliced into his knee and caused him to wobble slightly. Kojira didn't advance as he stared at the assassin step away from him. "We can end this here," he eventually remarked, "unless you have a warrior's pride and such." Although judging by how you were introduced, he meaningfully trailed off. Lautrec instead grumbled as he pushed himself to stand up straight. "I will not allow a sacrifice to Fina slip through my fingers," he grumbled as he assumed a shaky stance, "not this time." Charging forwards, he swiftly went on the attack with an almost frenzied barrage of swings. Sasaki retreated from the blows, either ducking or sidestepping them with an occasional parry to accompany them. Eventually, the assassin found the right moment to strike. When Lautrec swung up at his neck, Sasaki ducked down and slashed upwards towards his arm. The bronze-armored man released a hiss of pain as the shuttle dropped from his hand and the limb recoiled, blood trailing down from the wound to his elbow. Flicking his blade clean, Sasaki once again assumed his usual stance with both hands on the sword and the blade pointed directly towards his opponent. Lautrec stared at the wounded left arm, occasionally attempting to clench his hand into a fist and failing before he released an annoyed grunt and faced Kojiro. The man shifted his body into a new stance and smiled. "Still, you cannot say I did not warn you," he commented before the smile disappeared and he took in a deep breath. "Heiken," he stepped forwards and closed the distance with Lautrec as he swung the sword, Sabama Geishi. One blade became three. Lautrec wasn't even aware if they were illusions up until the point all three struck against his body, slicing into his legs and remaining arm with relative ease and causing him to drop to the ground with a groan, hissing as he bled profusely as a result. Sasaki, content with his work, sheathed his nodashi and calmly turned away to leave while Lautrec lay groaning on the ground. "Did he just?" Ash was stood up, pointing down at the battle with a baffled expression. "I saw 3 blades." "So did I," Roman exclaimed with shock. "What the heck? A noble phantasm of sorts?" Olga raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps he just generates copies of his attack." No. He was in 3 places at once." Romani choked out. "As in," the man waved his hands, as if there were 3 identical versions of him. "What?" Olga blinked, staring at Romani with wide eyes. But that's just, you can't just be in 3 places at once at the exact same time." She spluttered out. That would be to touch upon a true magic." "Is that good?" Ritsuka quietly asked Mash, the shielder looking more dumbfounded at the revelation than anything else. "Mash. Huh?" She blinked, then looked at Ritsuka before rapidly nodding her head. "Senpai. True magic is something that cannot be replicated through science at all. It is a true miracle." "Ooh." Ritsuka nodded his head, then frowned in thought. Didn't the director say that Ash used a true magic? "The act of moving across worlds is the second magic, Senpai," Mash dutifully explained, although his seems to have limits from what we have inferred. But still, she looked back down with awe. To think someone has a noble phantasm like that. So many servants in Chaldea who just brazenly use true magics. Olga growled into her hands. Why does every one of them insist on using miracles of magecraft to just swing swords around like savages? Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 86, Neurofest, IV. Neurofest, IV. Excitement was obviously running on an all-time high as the crowds awaited the next batch of combatants. Understandable, given the quality of opponents they had seen fight thus far. Although you would be hard-pressed to follow up on a battle involving a god and a man who could create 3 blows with one swing of his sword. While impressive, it meant that Nero would have to follow it up with something equally astounding for the people. A difficult task. However, she was confident that she could pull it off. Looking to her left, she noticed the Chaldeans all huddled together as they muttered to each other, likely discussing some plan they could use or who they were expecting to win. It was perfectly acceptable for them to give their support if they wished for it. What was currently puzzling Nero is which class she would have to follow up with. She had something special in mind for the Lancer class, and considering just who had shown up, she couldn't place them too early, and the Berserker class was far too aggressive for the moment. That and she wanted to build up expectations towards the finale, which meant she was left with either the Caster class or the Archer class to follow suit. She mentally sighed. It would likely be best to get the casters out of the way first, and with what she had seen of the servants attending, perhaps there would be some spectacle about how they fought each other. Some manner of spell throwing perhaps. It was always a good thought to hope for at any rate. Her eyes widened as she realized what could occur after this. She was no longer restricted to 7 classes, and to her knowledge, there was at least another shielder present here aside from the ones of Chaldea. The only issue was ruler class servants. She doubted a rat would be considered an appealing combatant at any rate. Although the goddess might be helpful, the issue was she looked like a child. It could just be the battle of the extra classes then. At any rate, she would think about it after this battle was done. For our next bout, she cried out, breaking the Chaldeans from their murmurs and bringing their attention back to her, along with the entire Colosseum. As she announced the next match, we shall witness the duel of the magical arts. A glimmer of excitement seemed to spark in the crowd,
those who wield the powers beyond the understanding of man. That's the opposite of Haumagecraft, Olga grumbled under her breath, then shook her head. Never mind.
And command them to do their bidding. Warriors not of the sword and spear but of the mind. She gestured to the far end of the Colosseum as the gates slowly rose up with a gentle creaking. A figure slowly paced out. But what of one who can wield both? She asked no one in particular. Our first combatant. He helped Chaldea save Rome against disaster even when faced with one he used to call master. Ash's eyes dulled as the figure stepped into the sun. The large greatsword in their right hand pointed across their body and upwards as their left silver sword pointed down. But he is no noble soul, for his acts are also steeped in foulness, she warned with an exaggerated tone. But for this moment, he fights for your entertainment. I present to you all Pontiff Sullivan of the Boreal Valley. Irithil. He corrected under his breath with a tone of annoyance. It's Irithil. He wasn't sure how he was convinced to participate in this stupidity. Actually, he was. The Nero girl, vexing little child that she was, had flat out blackmailed him into either competing in the caster class on behalf of Chaldea or she would place his seating back near Gwyndolin. He was under no illusions as to what his former covenant leader would do to him. To say nothing of the collection of goddesses he had managed to ally himself with. Quite frankly, he was annoyed about this entire affair. From being kidnapped by that wretch to being chained up and possibly being used as target practice, his nerves had been suitably strained to their breaking point. He wouldn't lie, the appealing thought of just mindlessly swinging his sword like a savage at something appeared to be a cathartic experience at the very least. Enough to get his mind off the annoyances he had faced up until now. It wasn't that he relished battle or enjoyed the thrill of the fight. He just wanted something to kill so he could feel slightly less irritable. Quite frankly, anyone who was willing to participate in this madness would do. No matter how small their role. He eventually came to a halt, remaining in his usual relaxed stance as he waited for the Queen of Jesters to announce the opponent he would be facing. He could also feel the judging eyes all over his body. He didn't even need to scan the crowd to see that some had been thoroughly incensed by his introduction. Like the girl flat out calling him a villain. That got on his nerves. Branding him a villain of all things. Still. Fools enjoyed the company of other fools, and those with enough common sense generally found life isolating at the top. He'd impressed as much upon Lothric. The boy understood there were few who could truly understand the curse as he could. Once he did. He supposed Lothric was lucky enough to have a brother who would stand by him no matter what. His reminiscing was cut short when Nero started to speak again. Joining him in arms is a servant, not a guest of Chaldea, but he asked to join in aiding them anyway. Nero continued on. Sullivan actually paused at that. His mind already coming to conclusions as to who would actually want to participate in this stupidity. They didn't give a name, so they shall remain caster. He mentally raised an eyebrow, then slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder as a man started to walk out of the same direction he had emerged. Sullivan internally frowned at the appearance of the man. Dressed in little more than dirt-colored rags in the shape of a shirt with clumps of fur around the shoulder with some bronze ornaments dangling from his waist. Trouser-wise, it was dark leathers with straps around his shins for added protection ending. The man was clearly tanned from what could be seen of his hands and what little was visible under the large hood he was wearing to cover his face. A pyromancer of the swamp, he muttered under his breath as the man walked forwards with purpose. Sullivan continued to examine the man. There was something about his posture and the way his ally carried themselves which almost made them appear aloof. The head rose up and allowed him to see the slightly hazel-colored eyes shining from beneath the hood. The man's lip quirked into a smile as he approached. Sullivan withheld the urge to scoff at the man. He slowly made to turn away as the man continued to approach with a certain level of determination. He barely managed to make it halfway to the pontiff before he tripped over his own feet and fell flat on his face. Dead silence. Sullivan's head paused in its movements. The man was still lying flat on the ground in the periphery of his vision. Wood creaked as the pontiff's face slowly scrunched up in disgust. Sorry about that, the man hastily apologized as he quickly attempted to climb back to his feet. Dusting himself down and wiping the sand off him. Hee. He let out a nervous chuckle before he looked at Sullivan with an almost sheepish expression under the hood. Sometimes I just don't look where I'm going.
You tripped over nothing, Sullivan pointed out in a toneless voice.
Well yes, the man agreed, raising a hand to reply before he paused. Working his jaw for a few moments, he slowly closed it again. I did, didn't I? He muttered to himself before giving an uncaring shrug. Oh well. Just means that the worst is behind me. It clearly isn't behind me, Sullivan bitterly thought to himself as he turned to face the direction he suspected his opponents would materialize from. As for who they would be, that was a different matter entirely. From what he had seen of sorcerers thus far, he was hardly impressed by their efforts. Save the Da Vinci woman, but the disparity between her and a hermit witch from a woodland was like night and day. He had yet to see the average. Continuing to look straight ahead, he didn't so much as glance down at the slightly shorter man as he stood next to him, still dusting sand out of his clothes, as they looked up at him before sweeping their gaze across the entire stadium. Amazing, big place, right? He spoke in a casual, if a little awestruck, voice with his eyes almost glimmering in wonder. A little too urban for my tastes, but I can appreciate the design.
I assume you would prefer a swamp with knee-high black water, Sullivan dryly retorted, eliciting a faint chuckle from the man next to him.
Yeah, I would, he admitted, but that's just how we priomancers are, liking to be closer to nature and all that. He paused. Although you're a lot closer to nature than I am.
Yes, Sullivan sighed, just keep your flames away from me.
Huh? Oh, right. Yeah. Castor rapidly nodded his head in understanding. Don't worry, I won't hit you with anything. I'm very careful. If you're as talented at pyromancy as you are at the simple act of walking, then I have much to fear from you. The pontiff grunted in response. Perhaps more so than my opponent. I mean, you could have a little faith in me, the man remarked as he reached up and scratched the back of his neck. I'm not that careless, just a little absent-minded. Although Quelana would always call me a bumbling fool, so, I don't know. Yes, I imagine she. Sullivan paused, his head whipping down to stare at the man in a new light as the name registered in his head. What did you just? And facing the twin casters or others from the lands beyond, Nero exclaimed out, drawing Sullivan's attention away from the man at his side and to the far end. The large iron gate rumbled and groaned as the weighty chains raised it up to unveil their contestants. Yet another duo of divinity seen fit to grace Rome. Sullivan frowned. Another god. He let out a tisk noise in response. He would rather not deal with a divine being. Those he could actually stomach the presence of were few and far between.
Castor let out a curious hum to his left, the man reaching up and scratching his chin. Might be a little challenging, oh well. He shrugged, clapping his hands and dousing them with fire before he swung them wide. Any opportunity, he winced as he felt his right hand collide with something. Sullivan stumbled as the back of the man's hand collided with his face. It wasn't as much from the impact of the strike as it was the fact the caster's hand was still on fire, and having that waved in his face wasn't something to enjoy. You clumsy, Sullivan hissed, stepping away from the caster and letting out a deeply annoyed growl. Keep your hands to yourself, oaf. I am so sorry. Castor instantly retracted the limbs and winced at the slight burn mark on Sullivan's cheek. Are you all right? Just, Sullivan let out a deep sigh, keep away from me.
Castor nodded his head slowly, still looking moderately guilty, before turning to look across as two figures emerged from the far end of the stadium. Their appearances could not have been more opposite if they tried, if only because one of them was blue and the other bright red. The man on the left was wearing a robe which would not have been out of place with the great swamp, ragged designs and furs around the hood. Although the large, elf-shaped staff made of wood was more reminiscent of sorcerers. The long blue ponytail swung behind him as crimson-red eyes locked onto the duo and a sharp grin came to the man's face. His partner was dressed in much cleaner bright red robes with equally red hair to match, his shorter than his partner but still in a ponytail design. Golden eyes signaled him as one of the divines, as he dismissively looked at the pair before letting out a scoff and turning his nose up at them. He positively sauntered towards the duo without ever truly looking at them, much to the obvious irritation of his partner, who seemed more exasperated with the act than anything else. Sullivan scanned the god with an inquisitive gaze. The red robes were oddly similar to that of a pyromancer, but much, much cleaner. The furs around the collar and shoulders were darker in coloration and well cut for the robe. There was golden lining within the front of the robe as they culminated in the emboldened shape of a fire. The pontiff already had a low opinion of this one. Is this all that can be brought to bear for one of my caliber? The god scoffed, shaking his head and still avoiding directly looking at the duo. Standing around the exact height is his companion, who rolled his eyes at him. Some feeble spirit and a common flame slinger. Golden eyes narrowed. It is an insult to my lineage. Yeah, I'm sure everyone's real broken up about it. The caster to his right remarked with a smirk, earning a frown from the god in question. You should speak to me with more respect, half-breed. His jab earned a scowl. Did your godly father never teach you to mock your betters? I know who my betters are. The blue-haired man scoffed in response. I've seen them fight. I ain't seen you do much of anything so far. He looked to the pair in front of him before fixing his eyes upon Sullivan. A combat caster are you? His grin sharpened, not afraid to get your hands dirty. Sullivan, meanwhile, just stared at the man in silence for a few moments before he titled his head. Were you not supposed to be armed with a spear? Motherfucker! The man exclaimed in outrage. Is he here? He is. Isn't he? He looked around frantically at the stands while waving his catalyst like a madman. You see the shit I got? You run off with my spear and drop all this bullshit on me. Give me my spear back and get this. He cut himself off, grumbling and shaking his head. Never mind. The three stared at him in silence, two in confusion and one in mild disgust. The red-haired god clicked his tongue and looked away. You embarrass my greatness by this display of foolery. Unless you have sound advice to offer, keep silent. And which of the Lordkin do we have the honor of addressing? The words slipped with Sullivan's mouth easily and sprinkled with enough venom to make it obvious what he really thought of it. The god turned to him and frowned. Speak to me with more respect. You are in a position few mortals are granted. He spread his arms wide. I am Flan, god of flame and king of Haida all fire has touched. Oh, now I know you. Sullivan casually remarked. You convinced the goddess Guinevere to elope after Gwyn's death. He hummed. The books had little to say from you aside from that. Little more than a background deity at the time. He paused, tilting his head. And Haida? I have never heard of it before. Perhaps it was a small kingdom or not long-lived. Remaining silent for a few moments longer, Sullivan eventually released a chuckle. Or it was so pitiful in its rule that Guinevere eventually abandoned you and sought out another, surviving cycle to cycle until she found herself in Lothric. Flan's eyes were burning with rage at this point. You should choose your next words carefully planned. He growled, fire dancing upon his arms. For they will be your last. My last? Sullivan tilted his head. I suppose I should make them count, should I not? The levity in his tone made it perfectly obvious he didn't take the gods seriously at all. I suppose at least Gwendolyn has the excuse of being hidden away as to why so little was known beyond his name. Your only claim to fame, so to speak, is the marriage of Gwyn's eldest daughter. An impressive achievement to be sure. The pontiff mocked. Clearly I should be in awe as I stand before a much deserving. Castor moved, raising his hand with the palm outstretched in front of Sullivan and unleashing a torrent of flames towards Flan. His own fires collided with the flame god as they unleashed their own attack towards Sullivan, accompanied by an indignant roar. The two attacks swiftly cancelled each other out in a wisp of smoke as Flan's glare went from Sullivan to Castor. Step aside, human. He growled, and I shall dispense my justice for this insult upon you swiftly and as painlessly as possible for being an associate of this base cur. I shall not. Castor frowned, flicking his hand and allowing flames to dance along his arms until they rested in the palm of his hands. For even if I disagree with his words, to knowledge of one calling themselves an authority of all the fires of life touch is not something I can idly stand to let be declared. You doubt me? Flan's eyes narrowed. Then I will demonstrate my title upon you. He raised his arms in a blocking movement as Castor slung his arms forwards in rapid motion. unleashing multiple balls of fire onto the god and causing him to growl in response. Caster Cu blinked at the sudden display before his battle instincts kicked in. His eyes darted to the side just in time to see Sullivan swinging a burning greatsword down towards him. Muttering under his breath, he jumped back while waving his hand in front of him, crafting a dozen glowing runes from his hand. The words of power coalesced into burning orbs of fire and rushed towards the pontiff. Sullivan slid to a halt, instead sweeping out his silver sword and unleashing a slash of purple light into the path of the runes. The attacks collided in an explosion of brilliant orange and violet light. Cu narrowed his eyes and waited, watching the cloud before his eyes snapped up. Sullivan burst forth from the smoke in a tremendous leap with his greatsword pointed downwards. Cu darted away from him as he slammed into the ground where he had been. The moment his greatsword touched the sand, it detonated in an explosion of profaned flame. The burning sand splashed near the caster while showing no signs of dying. The demigod narrowed his eyes at the flames and looked to the pontiff as he pulled his greatsword from the sands and turned towards him. "Some nasty fire you've got there," he commented idly, twirling his staff and adjusting his stance. "And a sneak attack too?" He clicked his tongue. "I've got some poor luck with dual wielders." "I care not." Sullivan grunted, his silver sword glowed a deep purple as he held it aloft and waved it in front of him. Cu watched as glowing orbs parted from the surface of the blade as fluttering trickles of light before they shot towards him like bullets. The caster's eyes narrowed before he slammed his palm into the ground. The sands shifted for a split second before roots ripped their way from the ground directly in the path of the projectiles. The fluttering lights crashed into the barricade and chipped sections off but otherwise left it standing. Cu slowly stood up straight and cracked a rather sharp grin at the pontiff. "Hey, sneaky one, ain't ya? As long as it ends this swiftly." Sullivan grunted in response, bringing both his swords crossed above his head and taking a deep breath. Cu was already tensing himself for movement, preparing the formation of runes in his mind as his fingers twitched. Sullivan angled his body forwards ever so slightly. It was the only warning to be given before he blurred into action. Wood shattered and splintered from the first blow, the profaned greatsword obliterating the wooden cover that Cu had made, the servant already moving backwards as Sullivan charged through the wreckage and swinging his glowing sword upwards. The caster leaned back, the glowing blade skimming just past his chin as he ignited his staff in flames, twirling it in his palm before sliding in close to Sullivan and thrusting it forwards. The taller caster noted the attack immediately. The profaned greatsword already moving to parry the strike away from his body before it could connect. Cu grimaced as he watched the greatsword descend. He knew for a fact he wasn't going to be able to reach Sullivan with the thrust before the pontiff reached him. So he didn't thrust. The staff shot out of his grasp like a bullet, slamming directly into Sullivan's ribs and causing him to release a grunt as the caster staggered back with the blow. The sudden explosion of rune magic didn't help either. The staff retracted into his hands moments before he heard Sullivan let out a deep guttural roar. The caster sweeping the purple glowing sword up as it sparkled with light, the weapon then released a slash of this power directly towards Cu. The Celt reacted, twirling his staff as the arc of light approached and holding it out like a guard. The blade of light impacted against his guard and forced him back in a sliding motion, the blade still going strong as it carried him an increasing distance from the caster before it eventually dissipated into nothing. Cu lowered the staff and took stock of his opponent. Sullivan straightened himself out, releasing the rather large black patch on his white robes from where he had been struck by the staff. The caster held no expression, not one that could be seen on account of the lack of a true face, but that didn't change much. Cu could tell as much from the tightened posture of Sullivan that he had clearly been incensed by the attack. Sullivan slowly raised his silver greatsword and held it in front of his body. An ethereal violet glow soon enshrouded his form in a transparent layer of light. Cu narrowed his eyes at the caster as he lowered his hand. At first he suspected it to be some manner of an enhancement upon himself. Then he watched Sullivan take a single step to the right as the ethereal duplicate remained standing where he had been moments ago. "Ah!" Cu blinked, looking between the two of them. "Soul-splitting magecraft. He grunted, then smirked. Well, if we're allowed to bring friends, he exclaimed out, twirling his staff above his head before he slammed it down into the ground. A circle of light slowly expanded forth before it gradually rose up. The light gathered into the shape of a pair of wolves. The two beasts circling around their summoner, snarling at the pontiff and his own summon. The summoning of animals, is it? Sullivan grunted. And no mere mongrel beasts, I see. His hands tightened on his swords before he splayed them on either side of him, his duplicate mimicking the action as it focused on the wolves. Very well. Cu whistled, shooting towards Sullivan as the wolves rushed towards his duplicate, the pair leaping at the purple shadow as it swung its ethereal sword towards them. The transparent blade passed just above the first wolf as it ducked down low before nipping at its ankles as the second wolf leapt into the air and towards the duplicate's head. The shadow spirit released a soundless grunt of exertion as it moved into action, swinging the flat of the greatsword into the side of the pouncing wolf's body and knocking it away from them before it lashed out with a kick and struck the second wolf in the side with a strike to the gut. The beast rolled before returning to its feet and snarling. Sullivan parried the burning staff skywards with his own embered weapon, the profaned greatsword finding more than a match in the runecraft-empowered catalyst, although Sullivan wasn't about to let himself be struck by the flames anyway. He was still a tree spirit, mixed blood or no, and that made him vulnerable to their embrace. He rushed forwards, swiping his twin swords with a flurry of movement which spoke of his training with the Dark Moon Knights. The movements were polished and without waste, each strike and slash designed to break away at an opponent's guard and give them no time to counter-attack. The problem was actually managing to hit them. Something that was proving moderately difficult. He had to hand it to the strange pyromancing sorcerer. They were at least adept in the art of dodging. Cu swung his burning staff forwards like a club, the weapon slamming into the glowing sword as it slashed towards his ribs. Nowhere near enough to stop the attack but enough to delay it and give him valuable time. As the weapon slowed, Cu took one hand off the staff and swiped it in front of Sullivan. The caster released another pained roar as a fresh batch of runes exploded in his face. More than enough time for the caster to swiftly engrave his staff with enough strengthening and enhancing runes for it to hit like a wrecking ball. By the time Sullivan reorientated himself, Cu was already swinging the catalyst towards his head. The large hook of the staff slammed into his temple with a crunch, rattling his brain and causing him to stumble back with the blow. Cu followed the strike through, swinging the staff down before he reversed his grip on it and turned it from a club to a spear and thrust it towards Sullivan's gut. His instincts went off, crimson eyes darting to the left just in time to see the shadow materialize directly next to him with the large greatsword swinging down towards his neck. Cu cancelled the thrust and leapt back. The overhead strike from the shadow passed just in front of him. However, it was more than enough time for Sullivan to right himself. The pontiff swiped his silver sword across, passing harmlessly through and slashing towards Cu's gut. The Celt leaned his body back as far as he could, yet wasn't quite fast enough to avoid feeling the sting of cold steel biting into his skin as it cut a thin line across his upper torso. The caster skipped backwards before pressing a hand over the light scratch, the twin wolves already rushing to his aid after having their prey abruptly vanish from them. All right then. Cu cracked his neck, his grin sharpening. Wish I had been a lancer instead. Would have been more fun. It would have been less troublesome. Sullivan grunted as he checked his front again. Another burn patch on his robes only served to elicit an annoyed growl from the caster before he raised his head to peer down at the slightly shorter man. No matter, I will simple have to deal. The arena behind the pair was violently consumed in an explosion of bright orange flames. Both Sullivan and Cu found themselves momentarily distracted as they turned towards the epicenter of the blast as the smoke slowly dissipated. Sullivan hummed as the shape of a panting flan became apparent. The god suffering from some mild burns along his arms while the unnamed pyromancer was untouched and staring at his opponent casually. A pyromancer of great skill it seems. I'll say. Cu agreed, blowing air through his lips. Fighting a god of fire with his own element and winning? That's just disrespectful, he cackled. Teacher would love it. You, Flan panted heavily, scowling at the caster as they stepped closer towards him. He could see the flickering of fire dancing along his hands as they prepared for another attack. Flan let out a deep snarl before he raised his hands into the air and clasped them together like a fist. Smoke billowed out from the gaps between his fingers as he pulled his hands apart to reveal a brilliant orb of fire hovering above his head. Castor stared back at him, their own flames dancing along their body before they converged on their left hand. The flaming orb above Flan's head slowly lowered until it hovered directly in front of him. The god pulled back his right fist and coalesced power into it before throwing it forward like a punch. Castor seized the opportunity, he swung his left hand out. The flames raced out from his palm and shot across the distance between the two of them like a whip before snapping around Flan's legs and coiling shut. The god's eyes widened in surprise at the sudden move before Castor pulled the fire whip towards him. Flan let out a squawk of surprise as his legs were swept out from underneath him and the fist swung just above the orb of fire. Castor retracted the whip as Flan's body hit the ground. The god groaned before he started to positively glow with rage. The sand around his body started to glow before it hardened into glass, shattering as the god released an excess of pure magical energy from his body before shooting upwards, slinging forwards dozens of fireballs in a blur of movement. Castor watched the orbs race towards him before he moved at a much greater speed than one would expect, ducking low and rolling to avoid most of them before he slid himself to a halt and swung his fist towards the final fireball. The moment his fist made contact with the fire, the flames washed over the limb harmlessly without so much as leaving single singe on his body. Flan gaped at the display before he roared in a mixture of anger and indignation. "You mortal swine," he growled, pulling the flames around his body into himself as his body glowed with a subtle red hue. "You dare seek to mock me?" Castor blinked in surprise. Huh? He paused. "No, I was trying to show you that you had much to learn. I mean you have a lot of potential in the art of pyromancy," he excitedly informed the deity before he paused, moving his hand up to cup his chin in thought. "I mean, maybe not as much as Carmina," he muttered to himself before shaking his head and giving the god a thumbs up of all things. "But you've got a lot of power there." Flan just stared at him in dead silence. The others on the bench watched as Farum covered his face with his hand. For a few moments they wondered what he was doing and why his shoulders were trembling before a faint noise came to their ears. Bemusement soon spread across their features followed by mirth as it became obvious that Farum was letting out a wheezing laugh. The former war god slowly shook his head before lowering his hand. The moment he caught sight of Flan's indignant expression, the wheeze returned with full force to the extent he slapped his hand over his knee. Farum leaned back, the wheeze developing into a full laugh. He said he had potential, he mocked loudly, causing the others to just give him odd looks. Potential? He's a god of flames and he has potential in the art of firecraft. PFFFTAHAHAHAHAHAHAHA. Both hands came up to his face, covering it up and muffling the laughter. Jean, whether through the slightly mocking implication or just the genuine nature of the writer's laugh, couldn't help the slight curling of her lip into a faint smile before it devolved into a gentle giggle of her own. She soon raised her hand to muffle the laughter. What was worse was the fact that Castor seemed genuine in his attempt to support the clearly prideful divine spirit. Releasing one final wheeze, Farum lowered his hands and let out a quiet cough. "Oh Flan. Such a fool, even the mortals are better than you." Shaking his head, his eyes darted over to the far end of the field. Sure enough, he saw Quelaag being far less subtle in her humor of the situation. She was just pointing and laughing at this point. Not that he blamed her. Flan was always rather prideful, thinking that an authority over flame automatically made him equal to a witch of chaos. That and his idolization of Gwyn was poorly hidden. Oh dear, he blinked as he heard a slightly worried voice. He looked down to see their newest arrival with an anxious expression on her face. Lord Flan is angry." Farum raised an eyebrow at her. "Lord Flan?" he asked incredulously. The golden-winged girl jolted and looked up at him with a pensive expression for a few moments before she nodded her head. "Lord Flan says to call him father undermines his authority." The girl rattled off swiftly. "All gods must address him as lord and his children are no different."
Farum stared at her in silence for a few moments before his eyes slowly returned to the god in question. Is that so? He rumbled quietly. Flan always had an inflated ego of himself. You know I mean, she coughed into her hand, correcting herself and assuming a more composed herself into a more formal posture. You are acquainted with Lord Florida. Don't call him Lord, Farum responded in a tired voice, one hand rubbing his temple in exasperation. He's your father, and it is hardly as if he holds any authority here of all places. He waved his other hand in a gesturing manner to the Colosseum. As for your first question? A long time ago, I suppose. He muttered out, then shook his head and looked down at her surprised expression. Really? She whispered out in an odd voice. I can tell you're a god, but you feel a bit weird. She frowned, reaching out and poking his arm hesitantly. Where did your divinity go? I gave most of it up. Farum admitted with a shrug, then pointed to the far end of the Colosseum. You're a daughter of Lady Guinevere, aren't you? Caffrey widened her eyes in surprise. How did you know that? Farum gave her a conspiratorial wink. I know. Did she ever tell you of Gwyndolin? The girl frowned. Uncle Gwyndolin, she muttered. She mentioned him once when I was younger and told me not to bring it up. She frowned, tapping the tips of her fingers together and actually looking much like a saddened child. She looked sad. Farum wordlessly hummed in response before he rested his left hand on her shoulder far more gently than could be expected of one his size and turned her to face the direction he was pointing. Do you see that one in the white dress with the crown shaped like the sun? Caffrey squinted her eyes for a few moments before they widened. Yes, I see him. Rapidly nodding her head, Farum let out a small chuckle. That is your Uncle Gwyndolin. He rumbled, giving her a gentle tap on the back. Go and greet him. Really? Caffrey fidgeted. But, I don't want to worry him. She looked up at the god and whispered. Also the spider lady looks scary. Quailog, Farum snorted. Harmless. He dismissed her concerns. On that I assure you. She just looks moderately frightening. Actually, she might look better than the last time I saw her. He jested with a note of amusement. Regardless, you should visit your uncle. He gently pushed her forwards. Go on, little one. He'll take a liking to you, I am certain. Really? Indeed. Farum nodded. Gwyndolin is a little sullen, but perhaps what he needs is a little luck to brighten his day. He smiled down at the girl behind his scarf. Caffrey gave a little giggle at the joke. All right, she exclaimed, flashing her wings out. I'll go and say hello to Uncle Gwyndolin. She beamed. Lo, father always said royalty should greet with royalty after all. She made to take off into the air before she paused and looked at Farum. What is your name, by the way? She asked. I never asked, sorry. She blushed, causing Farum to let out another chuckle at her. It is fine. As for my name, he paused, looking up. You can just call me Nameless. Caffrey frowned. That isn't a name. Yes, it is. No, it isn't, she pouted, then pointed at him. Your name can't be Nameless. Why not? Because, it isn't a name, really. He tilted his head and smiled. But what if I want it to be my name? That, well, Caffrey seemingly failed to form sentences for a few moments before she shook her head and pointed at Farum. That's still not a name. If you don't tell me, I'll give you bad luck, she threatened. The act earning only amusement from everyone in front of her and not just Farum. I'm sure. Farum chuckled, but I'm still Nameless, child. Just think of me as a passing divinity helping out his younger relative. Caffrey studied him with an inquisitive expression before she huffed and looked away. Well, you're still getting bad luck until you tell me, she shouted out, beating her wings and launching herself into the sky. Farum watched her leave before letting out a rumbling sound of amusement and shaking his head. Was that truly all right with you? Jean asked, looking at him with concern. If Gwyndolin is her uncle, does that not make you? I left before she was ever born, before the kingdom she was born in was even founded. Farum replied with a disinterested shrug. Whatever link I had to the old gods of Lordran, I have that up many, many years ago. He remained silent. Now shush. I'm watching the fight. I haven't seen Flan get a beating this bad since he made a snide remark about Goff within earshot of Artorias. That was always a memory that would live on in his head. It wouldn't surprise him if that pummeling from the night had actually inspired a fear of wolves in him. Now he was curious if this pyromancer could inspire a fear of flames in him. It would certainly be poetic irony for a god of fire to have a fear of his own authority.
The pillar of fire erupted from the ground, launching itself a colossal 5 meters into the air as it spun like a cyclone, the whirlwind acting as a barrier and blocking the dozen or so orbs of fire from striking him. Castor flicked his hand and pulled the pillar higher and higher until it was eventually free from the ground and became like a serpent, the elongated ribbon of flames following the caster's hands as he directed it through the sky and towards the god.
Flan snarled, swiping his hand upwards as the fire snake approached him and unleashing a thin blade of superheated flames towards it, slicing directly through the middle of the serpent as it rushed towards him and caused both sides to split apart on either side of him.
The moment the worm had been fully cut in half, Flan swung both his arms out and halted the two halves of the flames before they could dissipate into nothing. The god locked his size onto the mystery caster and made to swing his arms forward, with the intention of returning his spell to him. Caster held out his hand and snapped his fingers. Flan watched as the air in front of him shimmered and warped as if exposed to a dangerously high temperature before he watched thin wisps of bright orange flames rush towards a singular point directly in front of his face. Flan immediately understood what was about to occur and abandoned his spell, attempting to retreat, far too slow before the air detonated in a titanic explosion of flames which blasted him off his feet and sent him ragdolling through the air before roughly landing face first in the dirt. He placed his hands against the ground and slowly but surely pushed himself back up to his hands and knees. That was a good trick with the fire, Caster genuinely complimented with a wave of his hand to the god. But you need to be able to sense the air all around you, this was much easier explaining it to Carmina. He muttered to himself, shaking his head, anyway, you need tea. He ducked low as a jet of fire launched itself over his head. The man let out a surprised shout and scrambled back as Flan stood with his hand outstretched towards him. Eventually the god let out a roar and charged him, his body engulfed in fire and pulling his fist back in clear preparation for a powerful blow. Caster's eyes widened as the man let out a gasp of surprise, already moving backwards to try and clear the distance while raising his hand. Flan still charged towards him and would have continued to do so, up until Caster took in a deep breath before he exhaled. A thick purple smog erupted forth from between his lips and formed a cloud in between the two of them. Flan widened his eyes and threw his fist downwards, unleashing the explosion into the ground and using the power behind the detonation to launch himself into the air above the poisonous cloud. The deity clamped both his fists together as he raced down towards the caster. The man in question watched as Flan rushed with nothing shy of murder in his eyes. Then watched as a beam of purple light flew in from the side and slammed into the god's ribs, violently knocking them off course and causing their body to slam into the ground. Caster blinked in surprise, looking over and seeing Sullivan lower his sword from being pointed in his direction before swiftly returning to dueling the other caster. Hazel eyes narrowed as he watched the opposing servant flash his hand out again. The odd burning symbols formed in front of him before erupting outwards in tracking balls of fire seeking down his ally. Caster raised his own hand and looked between himself and the CU for a few moments. Divine pyromancy, he muttered to himself as he examined the spell, then jolted as he heard the familiar snarl and swiftly turned to see Flan already rushing towards him. Caster swept his hand through the air. This time the cloud of toxic case spawned directly in the god's face, the green mist instantly entering the divine spirit's lungs and causing them to cough and splutter as they clasped at their neck and backed away, only getting a little of the smoke in themselves, until they stood away from it. Caster thrust his right hand forwards, throwing out a singular jet of pyromancy flames into Flan which struck the god dead in the chest and barreled him over. After a few moments he cancelled the jet before bringing his fist above his head and slamming it down into the ground. Flan was already attempting to climb to his feet before the area around him glowed. He attempted to move far too late as the pillars of fire erupted out of the ground and consumed his form. Caster allowed himself a slight sigh of relief, then he paused. A frown swiftly came to his features as he watched the pillars of fire shift and flicker before they collapsed inwards towards the god as if drawn in by some other force. Flan burst out of the flames, his body awash in a sea of orange as more of the burning material seemingly soaked itself into him. Castor's eyes widened slightly and he backed away a little as Flan's body seemingly bulked out slightly, the musculature and height of the god increasing bit by bit until he was standing around the same height as Sullivan as opposed to his previous ally. Either way, he was now much taller than Castor, who was looking a little perturbed by the sudden change. Flan spread his arms wide, instantly dousing the flames at his side as his body glowed with an orange hue. "Now, human swine," Flan growled, shifting his arms. "You will truly understand just how low you really." Castor didn't exactly wait for him to finish monologuing. His mentor had always impressed upon him the importance of seeing a chance and taking it. So he did. He called upon some of her spells she had taught him herself. The flames in his hands deepened and became more erratic as the essence of chaos took hold of them. Flan actually seemed to register the sudden development before Castor thrust his hands forward. The god widened his eyes and raised his arms in a blocking motion as the chaos flames slammed into him. The titular beam of extreme heat hit the god like a runaway Taurus demon and sent him rolling backwards. Even as his noble phantasm attempted to consume the flames, it simply wasn't possible for him to absorb all of them. Deep within his soul, he understood that the pyromancer was just capable of generating more magical energy than he could. That was a sobering thought, and the final one he had as his feet could no longer keep him on the ground and came loose, causing him to hurtle through the air and crash into the wall of the Colosseum, shattering the stonework and scorching the bricks around him black. The humanoid-shaped crater in the wall revealed the shape of Flan embedded in it, his eyes dull and looking at nothing before he slowly peeled away and fell flat on his face. When he didn't move but didn't disappear, he concluded he had knocked the divine spirit out cold. Castor winced. He went and made a bungle of the situation again. He nervously looked around to see how his ally was faring. Sullivan recoiled as another explosion of flames caused him to jolt backwards, hissing as the staff slammed into his left hand and caused him to loosen his hold on his sword of judgment. The blade lost its hue as it dropped to the ground with a clatter. He didn't allow Cu to push his advantage, swinging the profaned greatsword down towards him and forcing him to step back to avoid being hit by it. Sullivan then swept the sword to the side with it, leaving behind a trail of chaotic flames and forcing him to further increase the distance. Pulling his arm back, he thrust forwards and launched his entire body into the attack. Cu widened his eyes at the sudden burst of movement and raised his own staff to block the attack, enhancing it as far as he dared as the tip of the sword impacted against his guard. If Cu had been a lancer, he suspected he would have held the caster back easily. Unfortunately, he wasn't a lancer. He was a caster and his luck was bullshit. The thrust by Sullivan caused him to stumble backwards, the pontiff following through and swinging the sword down towards his neck. Cu slammed his staff into the ground and rose up a collection of branches to block the sword. The weapon clanged off the makeshift shield and caused Sullivan to let out a growl. Cu smirked before bringing his palm down and slamming it into the ground as well. Sullivan paused as a burning ring opened up in the space behind Cu. Then a giant fist made of wicker erupted from the circle and struck him dead in the face. And in the torso. It effectively just punched his entire body and sent him reeling away from the impact and into a pained roll as he tried to contemplate just where that had even come from to begin with. As he slowly rose back to his feet, Sullivan watched as the spirit wolves pounced towards him. He didn't even bother moving as his shadow swept in from the side and sliced through the first wolf with ease and reduced it to motes of light. The second wolf clamped down onto the spirit's right arm and pulled, dragging the limb, and the spirit, towards the ground before engaging in a pulling match for the limb. Sullivan barely gave it any thought as he stabbed his greatsword into the sand and used it to push himself up. Watching the caster already preparing another collection of his runes, Sullivan growled, swiftly pulling his blade free and charging towards the caster. Cu then smirked. Sullivan paused as he felt the ground heat up under his feet. The last thing he saw before he found himself hurtling through the air was the burning shape of a dozen of those runes in the ground before his vision was absorbed in a bright flash and he felt himself go weightless. The sense of levitation lasted a few moments before he crashed into the ground. Now then, Cu tapped his staff on the ground, then swung it out towards the shadow servant held captive by the single remaining wolf. The dozen orbs of fire slammed into its body and consumed it in a blazing inferno. The wolf panted as it jogged out of the smoke and back to the caster. "Good work there, boy." He thanked the wolf as he pet it, looking towards the remaining caster. "No." He cut himself off and just stared. The opposing caster had well over 100 glowing orbs of fire hovering just behind his head. The cloaked man gave an awkward wave. "I saw your divine pyromancy," he called out. "Impressive." "Cu shouted back. "You mean my runes? They can do other stuff aside from flames, and really, I'm just an amateur when it comes to it." "Really?" Caster shouted back. "I wasn't sure because I had never seen it before." He frowned, tapping his foot on the ground before he waved his hand out in front of him. "Was this how it worked?" "Man, what the fuck?" Cu stabbed his staff at the man as he watched him craft a series of runes identical to his own. "That's some bullshit." "Is it?" Caster frowned. "I don't understand it myself, so I don't know what it will actually do." Sure enough, the runes fizzled away without even doing anything before he waved his hand. "I'm sure I'll figure it out though." He cheerily waved. "New pyromancies, how exciting." "Yeah, terrific." Cu snorted, shaking his head. The man certainly seemed enthusiastic to say the least. "Right, you've bested a god. Now let's see you try your luck against a." Caster unleashed the bombardment before he could even finish his sentence. "Cu Chilane just died." Mash exclaimed in horror as she shot to her feet. "That caster servant." Olga was more concerned with the other one. "He just bested a god of fire with fire." She shouted in bewilderment. "There's no way he's purely human." "He is." Cecilia spoke up, her visor directed towards the caster. "His soul is purely that of a mortal man. 'Tis much older than my own, however, from an age long past." That gave Olga pause. She frowned as she cupped her chin. "Then they were an older legend than the god?" she muttered to herself. Then looked down at Cecilia. "Can you tell us anything else?" Cecilia shook her head. "Not at this distance, Lady Olga. 'T would require use of my eyes. It is not that great a mystery to allow you to cause yourself suffering." Ash cut her off before she could continue. The undead staring down as the smoke settled, revealing a thoroughly unconscious Cu Chilane and the mystery caster currently dragging away an equally injured Sullivan to safety. And a human beating a god is not that great a surprise, provided their soul is of great power. Ash isn't wrong, although this really isn't the same sort of case as with the Gorgon sisters. Roman replied with a frown as he scratched his chin. "The caster demonstrated much greater competency with that magecraft. I think he also tried to copy the runes at the end. But they didn't do anything." Mash pointed out, tilting her head and frowning. "Did they?" "No," Roman shook his head. "They didn't. Maybe it is like a problem with the caster and an unfamiliar system of magecraft." He wondered aloud. Still, to be able to discern and mimic old magecraft at just a glance. He's certainly a powerful caster at any rate. It could also be a case that the enemy caster was a sloppy fool. Leonidas pointed out, cupping his helmet. His attacks were powerful but careless. He seemed to just swing his weight around without a true style. Perhaps he has simply never fought an intelligent foe. Perhaps. Nero nodded her head, but for now, we have another performance to attend to. She announced. That was a most enjoyable spectacle, but now is the time for another. She proclaimed as she walked forwards. My Romans, now is the time for another battle of the divine, but this time they shall face each other. The crowd seemed to find that appealing as they broke out into pleased roars. For today, we determine the greater god of moonlight. She spread her arms wide. We find ourselves with our own goddess, Diana. Artemis paused at the name, wincing in turn as the crowd positively cheered for her. Diana, huh? Orion let out a hum. That's nice. It wasn't like that, darling. Artemis pointed out. Just getting some air is all. And for her opponent, Nero continued on, born in a distant land and a child of the king of his own gods. The god of the dark moon and captain of their legion, Gwyndolin. Well, Orion let out a faint laugh. This should be something good. The god appeared at the opposite end of the stadium in a flash of light, the snake limbs already rising up and staring at the duo. The god's expression was perfectly vacant as he gazed dispassionately at them.
Hey, Linny. Artemis waved her hand in greeting, we're gonna compete. Okay. Gwyndolin's posture broke and he slammed his hand onto his mask in exasperation. Mystery caster and Flan. What a surprise. No stat sheet for Flan though, as I'm debating whether or not to fully add him in properly this early. Probably not, so when he does eventually arrive, I'll reveal his stats and dialogue properly. Think of it like a Jason scenario. Although yes, he is a blowhard.